Oh, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 2 for PPA 500. I trust your week is hopefully off to a good start. Topic for tonight will be accountability, but before we get into our discussion for tonight, just a couple of really quick announcements for you. The first one concerns the D1DA, the Day One Digital Access. I know we've kind of gone back and forth on this a little bit, but I spent last week in discussions with the good folks over at D1DA about whether or not the program really fits our DLMPA program well. Again, with our DLMPA program, not all of your courses obviously are going to be starting at the beginning of the semester. You'll have some courses that start halfway through the semester. For example, your next course in the program, PPA 577, is not going to start until March 22nd, which is well after the February 3rd opt-out date. And that's going to be the case moving forward with pretty much the rest of the semesters in the program. So in discussions with D1DA, the people over there recommended that we exempt this program from the D1DA approach. They just feel that it's probably easier on them and we can avoid any issues with people getting charged for materials that they are not using. So the way in which we're going to handle it is that the other two cohorts in this program, cohorts 23 and 24, are going to be opted out right now. So they've already been opted out of the program. However, for this cohort, since we are already here in 500, it's kind of unusual that 500 started right at the beginning of the stateside semester. And I know that there are some folks in here who are using the digital materials. We don't want you to lose access to those. So what we are going to do is we're going to keep this course in 577 in the D1DA program for the remainder of the spring semester. And so if you're currently using the digital materials under the program here in this course, you're going to be able to maintain access to them. If you have chosen not to use those materials and you need to opt out, today is the deadline to opt out. And I know I've told you this ad nauseum, but I'll tell you one more time. Today, February 3rd, is the last day to opt out. So you can either opt out on the My Textbooks Hub in our Canvas course, or you can send an email to d1da@csulb.edu, and that will then opt you out, so you will not get that charge being applied to your student account. Now, moving forward into the 577 course, your next upcoming course, the same type of rules apply, except that D1DA has given us a different opt-out deadline because the course is starting later in the semester. So what they have told us for 577 is that if you want to opt out of using the digital materials, then you have until April 5th to opt out in 577. Now, I know a lot of people haven't been registered in 577 yet, and that won't happen for a while. But once that course begins, you have 2 weeks. So it begins on March 22nd, which means you'll then have to April 5th to opt out if you don't want to use the digital materials in 577. So again, today is a day to opt out for this 500 course. For 577, the day to opt out would be April the 5th. And then what we'll do is then moving forward, each semester, Geraldine will send the rosters of the DLMPA program to D1DA, and they'll do what they need to do on their back end to just opt everybody out. And then we don't have to worry about people being charged materials that they are not using. And that's one of the reasons why I want to know how many people are using it, how many people are not using it. And it seems like the majority of folks in the program are not using it. And so that's why D1DA has recommended that we just kind of exempt the DLMPA program from the D1DA type of approach. Esperanza asks a question, will there be a new charge each time a class is added? That's a good question. My assumption is that it's a semester charge. So I believe that's the charge for the semester because they charge you based upon whether you are a full-time or a part-time student. The way in which our program works, you're pretty much always going to be considered a part-time student because you'll have less than 8 units per semester. I believe that is a semester charge that they apply. I'm pretty sure about that. Okay. So again, please opt out today if you're planning on opting out because this is the last day to do so for the materials here in PPA 500. Then the other announcement I have is just an announcement in terms of upcoming assignments. And many of you have already done these two assignments, but if you have not done them yet, the due date for both the initial skills self-assessment as well as Canvas essay number one, the due date for both of those will be next Monday on February 10th. They got to kind of move the due dates back a week in our new version of the syllabus. I know a lot of people have already turned them in. And so if you've turned in your initial skills self-assessment, I've already reviewed it, and they've all, again, there are no right or wrong answers. And so if you fill out all three sections, then you get full credit for it. So I've already looked at that. But if you haven't, please turn that in by next Monday. And then Canvas essay number one, where you look at Madison's Federalist Paper number 10 that we talked about in class last week. For that, you'll be talking about whether or not you think we are more factionalized today than we were in Madison's time, and then what kind of recommendations you can come up with to try and mitigate the effects of factions. Because we know that Madison tells us we can't eliminate factions, because eliminating factions is equivalent to eliminating democracy. So instead, in a compound republic, what we need to do is we need to balance faction against faction. And so what types of strategies would you come up with in order to try and balance these factions, to try and make their say in the policymaking process a little bit more equal? Because we know that we have some interest groups today that certainly have a great deal of variability in terms of their resources. Interest groups have resources in terms of their money, the amount of money they can contribute to candidates in the campaign cycle. We know another resource they can rely upon is the size of their membership. And you've got some interest groups like the AARP, our single largest current interest group in this country. The AARP can go to a member of the House of Representatives and say, we have 20% of the constituents in your district belong to the AARP. That's a very big way to sway a member of the House of Representatives who think a certain type of way. The types of members that you have can also have an influence upon how many resources you have in affecting policymaking. You think about some interest groups like the ABA, the American Bar Association. They are comprised primarily of lawyers. Well, what's the number one profession in both the House and the Senate? Attorney. And so because of the types of members that they have, they're able to then hold sway with some of those members of Congress. Members of the AMA, they also have some members that certainly have the resources in order to try and influence policymaking. So, kind of think through some of the things that you think we could do to try and make it easier to balance faction against faction, interest group against interest group in our current system of governance. And you will be giving me a response to that initial prompt, and then you'll be responding to two of your classmates. So all three of those responses then will be due again by next Monday on February the 10th. Right. I think those are my two announcements. I had a little bit of an internet scare about 20 minutes before class began, and I had a complete internet outage. Worked on it for a while, and fortunately now it is back up and running. If for some reason I do end up getting disconnected tonight, then just stay on, stay in the session. The session should stay open, and then I'll get back on as soon as possible. But I think all those problems have been rectified, and hopefully everything will go very smoothly this evening. All right. Okay. What I have on the agenda for tonight is a discussion of accountability and ethics in the public sector. We'll talk about what accountability is. We'll talk about the differences in ethical standards in the public and private sectors and why we have those differences. We'll talk about why ensuring accountability and ethics can sometimes be difficult in the public sector. We'll also talk about different approaches to understanding accountability. We'll talk about how the field of public administration has viewed accountability over the past 150 years, 140 odd years, I guess it is. And we'll then talk about the American Society for Public Administration, or ASPA, those 8 different principles in the Code of Conduct. We'll go through each of those 8 principles to then prepare you for Canvas essay number 2. And in Canvas essay number 2, what you'll be doing is selecting 3 of those 8 principles that you think would be the most challenging to implement either on an individual basis or would be very challenging to implement in your organization. And this will then, information will provide the basis then for Canvas essay number 2. Then once we get through that information, we will then do some breakout rooms. I told you I'm really a big fan of breakout rooms, especially early on here in the program. Since you are a cohort-based program, you really need the opportunity to work together and get to know each other. And so what we'll do then is we'll break up into breakout rooms. I'll probably break up into maybe, given the numbers we have, you'll probably still do about 4 breakout rooms. I'll just randomly assign you to breakout rooms. Then I have a little exercise on our last slide where you will talk as a group about a contemporary ethical problem, some type of ethical instance that you are familiar with, and relate it back to the ASPA Code of Ethics. And so we'll spend maybe about half an hour, 45 minutes in those breakout rooms. Then we'll reconvene as a class, and then each room will have a spokesperson who can then share out what the room came up with. And then after that, we finish up all of our accountability on ethics information. Then I'll talk to you very briefly about doing research in public administration, APA formatting, journals, and how we can determine what is a credible journal versus what is not really considered a credible journal. Some of that information. I'm going to stop the session a little bit early tonight because, as I told you last week, I do have that video under the module for this week from Kelly Janicek from a previous 500 section where she led about an hour discussion on how you do research in public administration using university databases. And since that's about an hour-long video, we'll knock off a little early tonight because I don't want you to have a 3-hour session tonight, plus then have to watch an hour video. I don't think that's really fair. So we'll have a shorter session tonight and then afford you the opportunity to have that hour to then watch that video by Kelly Janicek. So that is a long-winded description of what our agenda looks like for this evening. So let's go ahead and jump into it and talk about accountability and ethics in the public sector. And this is a really interesting time for us to be talking about accountability and ethics in the public sector because it's really kind of a moving target. And there have been a lot of things that have been changing over the past couple of weeks that certainly have implications for ethical adherence and the implementation of ethical standards, especially at the federal level. So some of the information that we're going to talk about tonight, I am going to append onto that information some recent changes over the last few days that may make it a little different. I won't say easier or harder, but a little different for us in terms of assuring ethical adherence. So I think we all have a really good sense of what we mean by the term accountability. We are holding people to account for their actions. We are examining how people relate with things in their environment. So accountability is really all about the relationship between people. And for our purposes, we're talking administrators and how they relate to things in their environment. So a relationship between administrators and money. So how do these administrators implement their budgets? How do they spend their money? Are they spending their money on the areas that the appropriation legislation requires? So are they spending the money in the legally appropriated manner, or are they spending the money elsewhere in ways that do not have legal permission, legal authority from Congress? So we look at how they spend the money. We look at how they're spending public money to make sure that it's being spent for public interest, for public purposes, as opposed to their own private interests. We look at the relationship between administrators and other people. So administrators interface with citizens. And so accountability and ethics can look at how they treat those citizens that they are dealing with. Are they protecting the constitutional rights and privileges of those citizens? We also look at how administrators relate with institutions, how administrators relate with information. We know that today in the public sector, information is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. And it comes from both credible as well as non-credible sources. We know the rise of social media. I know a lot of people talked about social media in Canvas essay number 1 as one of the primary challenges for balancing factions, because a lot of this information coming from sources on social media obviously will not be vetted information. So how do people access and how do they use information to best serve the public interest? I think a great example of that comes to us from the old political machines that used to dominate our major cities in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And I'm sure you're familiar with some of these political machines. One of the most famous political machines was Tammany Hall in New York City. And Tammany Hall ran New York City. It was a political machine that ran every aspect pretty much of city governance, whether it be how money was being spent, who got contracts and who did not get contracts, who got hired to work in city government, how they were retained and how they were fired. Just about every aspect of city governance was controlled by this political machine. One of the individuals who worked in Tammany Hall, who actually spoke out about his experience working in Tammany Hall, was a gentleman by the name of George Washington Plunkett. And George Washington Plunkett was a big believer in Tammany Hall. He was a big believer in making administrative decisions based upon political imperatives. He was very much a dyed-in-the-wool partisan. So he believed that you should get your job working for the city of New York based upon, did you support the right candidate? Did you support the winning political party? It's kind of in that patronage era of public employment, the whole idea of to the victor go the spoils. And so Plunkett, once his time in Tammany Hall ended, he then wrote his memoirs. And it resulted in a book called Plunkett of Tammany Hall. And in Plunkett of Tammany Hall, George Washington Plunkett makes some really interesting arguments to us about ethics that I think we probably would have a lot of trouble with today. One of the interesting arguments that he makes is that not all graft is bad. And the term graft today, we really kind of equate, or we do equate it with the idea of corruption. So when we hear of graft, we think corruption. He made the argument that not all graft, not all corruption is bad. He made the argument that there is obviously dishonest corruption, but there's also an honest version of corruption and graft. Well, that sounds kind of weird to us today because all graft, all corruption is, we would think, is dishonest. But he argues that there is a difference to be made. For example, according to Plunkett, dishonest corruption occurs, for instance, if you have someone who's working for the city government who steals public taxpayer money. So they literally steal money from the drawer and take it home with them at night. That, he says, is dishonest corruption. That's bad. That's something we need to avoid. I think we would all agree with that. But he said there's another part of corruption that is not that dishonest. He calls it honest graft. And he gives us an example. He says, let's say, for example, in my position in city government, I find out that the city is going to buy this parcel of land and make a park out of it. And in order to make this park they want to make, they have to own this parcel of land. So I find that out as part of my duties as an administrator for the city. I go out there and I buy this parcel of land, and I buy it at a very low cost. Then when the city gets around to wanting to build this park, they have to then buy the land from me. So I'll resell it to the city at a huge profit margin, and I'll pocket the extra money. He said that's honest. That's honest corruption. He considered that to be honest corruption because he saw his opportunity and he took it. He wasn't stealing money in his mind. He instead was using the information that he had in order to make a profit. Well, now, obviously, today we would disagree with Plunkett and we would say that is an example of corruption, because what he is doing is he's using his public position and his access to this information in order to enhance his private interests. So he's putting his own private interests over the interests of the public. But it's just kind of interesting how our perspective on corruption, our perspective on ethical adherence really has changed a great deal since back in the days of Tammany Hall. And we'll return and talk more about George Washington Plunkett and some of his ideas when we get to our discussion of civil service. And as we talk in a few weeks about how our system of hiring moved from an era of gentlemen to an era of patronage to an era of merit and civil service, I'll go back and reference George Washington Plunkett and some of his other ideas in terms of what he thought proper influence was of politics in the hiring and retention of federal employees. But this is just kind of an example of how he thought this relationship between people and information was different than how we envision the relationship between people and information today. Accountability and ethics really serves as the foundation of bureaucracy. The problem that we have in our system of civil service, and it's both an advantage as well as a problem, is that we have a lot of career civil servants. Now, these people are hired based upon their merit. They're hired based upon what they know, their ability to do the job efficiently and effectively. However, by being hired through civil service processes, they do not have the same conduit to the voters as elected officials do. Now, if you're a member of the House of Representatives, you're running for reelection every 2 years. You're very much tethered to public opinion. Now, if you're a member of the Senate, you run every 6 years, but you still have that connection to public opinion because you have to get the approval of the public in order to remain in office. Obviously, that's not how civil servants remain in office. They remain in office based upon how well they are doing their job. So, since we don't have that connection between the public, the people, and these career civil servants, it's up to the elected officials who are tethered to public opinion to hold administrators to account for their actions. If we don't have elected officials who are willing to hold administrators accountable for their actions, then it's going to be impossible for us to ensure ethical adherence. And the problem we run into is that elected officials enjoy being elected officials, which means their primary motivation is usually to keep their jobs, to get reelected. Well, whenever they hold administrators accountable, accountability is often seen in a very negative light because accountability focuses on discovering problems. So whenever you hold someone accountable, you are finding a problem. And whenever you find that problem as an elected official, you are then connected to that problem in the eyes of the public. So a lot of elected officials try and keep their distance, and they try and stay away from holding administrators accountable for their actions. Elected officials oftentimes do not want that clear chain of accountability because it makes them more accountable in return. When elected officials do not want to get engaged in accountability and holding administrators accountable for their actions, that provides us with some problems with oversight. Now, the ones who hold administrators at the federal level accountable for their actions will be Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution. Congress has the power of the purse strings. We know that Congress has the power to appropriate money, that no money can be pulled from the Treasury without the course of appropriations, as the Constitution tells us. So they appropriate the money to be spent. And they do that in these appropriation bills that are then signed by the president. They also engage in authorization. So if you're going to have a new agency or a new program that will come into existence, that new agency, that new program must come into existence through that authorization process. So Congress creates these agencies. They then give the money to these agencies. They empower these agencies in terms of their functions and duties and responsibilities. And they then maintain oversight over those agencies and those administrators as well. So they can pull these administrators in to a congressional hearing, and they can grill them at this congressional hearing about what's going on within their agencies. Whenever Congress exercises oversight over agencies and administrators, they are engaging in what's called the principal-agent relationship. The principal-agent relationship, you have a principal who is the overseer, and then you have an agent who is the one that's being overseen. So obviously the principal in this discussion will be Congress. The agent will be the federal department or the federal agency or administrator. The problem is you would assume that the principal, because they are the overseer, that they will have the information. They will have all the information and knowledge that they need to properly oversee the actions of those administrators. The problem, as we know, is that usually what goes on in the agency on a daily basis, members of Congress don't have access to that. Who knows best what's going on a daily basis within that organization than the people who are in that organization daily? So it's the organization, it's the agent that has the information as opposed to the principal members of Congress. That's what's known as information asymmetry. So you have a lot of information asymmetry going on in this principal-agent relationship. Whenever the agent has more information than the principal, then we have what's referred to as a moral hazard. Then the agent has a moral hazard that they are facing. And that moral hazard means that they have to then make a decision how much and what information to provide to the overseer, to provide to Congress, to allow Congress to oversee their actions. Well, obviously, there's a disincentive there because the more information, the more insight you provide in terms of what's going on a daily basis in your organization, the easier you are making it for Congress to oversee your actions and to hold you and your agency accountable for those actions. And that's the moral hazard, the ethical dilemma that agents have in the principal-agent relationship. Now, as we get later on in the class session tonight, we talk about the ASPA Code of Ethics. We'll see that one of those principles is to be fully transparent and to disclose information to governing bodies and to elected officials. So one of our ethical principles is to provide this information. But by providing the information, you are then making yourself even more subject to oversight and accountability. So sometimes the principal-agent relationship doesn't really work the way in which we want it to work because of information asymmetry, and also because sometimes elected officials do not really have much interest in overseeing administrators and holding them accountable for their actions because of the negative impact it may have on their reelection prospects. So we have this oversight, this principal-agent relationship between agencies and members of Congress. Article 2 of the Constitution tells us that the president is the chief executive, that the president is the chief of the executive branch. Article 2 tells us that presidents can fill vacancies. Sometimes it requires the consent of the Senate, sometimes it does not, but they can make these appointments. They also have the ability to require opinions, according to the Constitution, of these federal officers. So by having the ability to appoint people, having the ability to require their opinions, that has been construed by the courts as placing the president at the head of the federal bureaucracy. So we not only have oversight coming from Congress, we also have oversight coming from the presidency. And this is where we are going to find ourselves in a very interesting situation moving forward. I'll give you an example. In the Obama administration, as part of one of the fiscal year budgets of Obama, President Obama put in a line item to create inspector general offices in all the federal agencies and departments across the federal bureaucracy. So inspector general, the position of inspector general, was supposed to be located within an agency, and then that individual was in charge of oversight of that agency, to hold people accountable, to try and make sure that all the actions going on in that agency were ethical. If you had anyone blowing the whistle on something that was not ethical in the organization, they could blow the whistle to the inspector general office. So every agency, every department would have its own office of inspector general. And it created 73 inspector general positions. Now, over the past week, the Trump administration, through executive order, has effectively eliminated 18 of those 73 inspector general positions. Now, this introduces an interesting constitutional question. If these inspector general positions were created by Congress, they were authorized by Congress, the money to pay for the salaries of the people who work in those offices was appropriated by Congress, can the president, as the head of the executive branch, then come in and eliminate those inspector general positions? We're going to have to see. And so right now, 18 of those 73 inspectors general are kind of in limbo in terms of whether or not they're going to have continuing employment. It looks like they're probably not, but we're going to have to wait and see what types of legal challenges there are and whether or not the president has that ability to get rid of those inspectors general. So if those inspector general positions are abolished, and if eventually all 73 of those positions are abolished, then that will be one less oversight mechanism that you'll have in the federal bureaucracy to be able to conduct that type of in-agency oversight. Then we also have the issue of executive privilege. And so these administrators are working within the executive branch. So whenever Congress calls these individuals in to have a discussion about what's going on within those agencies, We have seen in the past at some upper levels, some of these individuals have claimed executive privilege, where they have said, this is a conversation that I had with the president, and so therefore it's covered under executive privilege. Presidents oftentimes will claim executive privilege and say that this person cannot testify before Congress because I'm claiming executive privilege over that discussion that I had with that individual. So sometimes executive privilege can shield some of this testimony and make it more difficult for Congress to get access to this information that they believe is necessary to allow them to properly conduct their oversight. So even though, in a basic civics class, we would say Congress oversees the bureaucracy, it's not always that easy. And it's a much more difficult, much messier type of situation when they do try and hold administrators accountable for their actions. Now, a lot of the reductions in the federal workforce or proposed reductions in the federal workforce and a lot of the proposed elimination of agencies. You've probably seen in the news the proposed elimination of USAID. And USAID, the employees at USAID got an email just after midnight this morning saying, do not report to work, stay home. Then those who did come to work, the doors were blocked to the offices of USAID. And the president, as in addition to Elon Musk, have both made it very clear that they believe that there are a lot of ethical violations from their perspective in USAID. And so they are certainly taking steps to if not eliminate USAID, at least fold it into the US State Department. And so a lot of this impetus from the White House to get rid of USAID is being couched within an ethical discussion and purported violations of ethics. And again, I'm not going to get into all that, but it's just an example of how ethics really are a very big issue, especially over the past couple of weeks, and we'll see how that plays out into the future. Clearly, we want an ethical bureaucracy. Clearly, we want people working in the bureaucracy who are really committed to the public interest and value public interest over their own private interest. In order to make sure that that happens, we need to be able to hold people accountable for their actions, but then also realize we need to also free them up enough so they can be creative and innovative in how they do their jobs. It really is very much striking that balance, making sure that we control the actions of administrators to hold them accountable, but also to make sure that the work gets done. It doesn't only get done, but gets done well, and that we're actually creating the consequences, the positive consequences that we need to create for our citizens. Too many accountability measures can certainly inhibit bold action and can also make it more difficult for us to attract the best and the brightest into public service. Now, the way in which we have viewed accountability and ethics in the field of public administration has certainly changed over the years. It's kind of been a very dynamic definition of how we can hold people accountable for their actions. One of the primary articles that you will be reading in this class, and we'll get to it in a couple of weeks, is what's considered to be the classic seminal article in the field by Woodrow Wilson called The Study of Administration. If you took any undergraduate public administration class, I'm sure you have read this article. We will read it, we will kind of pull it apart, and we'll deconstruct it into its component elements. Because what Wilson did in that article is he essentially advocated for the separate study of public administration. So in that article, he made this argument for the politics administration dichotomy, which I'm sure you have heard of before. So according to Wilson, we have the political side and we have the administrative side. The political side is comprised of elected officials who are the policymakers. So those are your members of Congress, those are your members of state legislatures. These are the people who are making public policies. They are the ones who are closely tethered to the public and to public opinion. Then you have the administrative side. Now, the administrative side, you have these non-elected, these unelected administrators, and their job then is to execute those policies that have been created by those policymakers, those elected officials. Now, there are a lot of problems with the politics administration dichotomy, and we'll get into those in a more fulsome fashion when we talk about the Wilson article in a couple of weeks. But just suffice to say right now, One of the major problems of the politics administration dichotomy is that it's not as much of a dichotomy as Wilson might have led us to believe back in 1887. That yes, we have elected officials making policy and we have administrators who are implementing that policy, but we have very much of a bleed over effect between the two worlds of politics and administration. We have administrators who are not only implementing policy, but they are also writing the rules to govern what that policy looks like and how that policy gets implemented. When you go through this administrative rulemaking process, where you write the rules that govern the implementation of a policy, you are essentially creating policy itself. And so these policies do not just implement themselves. We have to have rules that govern their implementation. Under the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act, you then go through this rulemaking process where members of the bureaucracy, these administrators, will then propose a rule. They'll then have to have public hearings on that rule, and then they'll approve a rule that will govern the implementation of the policy. By proposing and implementing that rule, you are basically formulating policy. Also, we know that the experts on those policies will be those administrators who are implementing those policies. So, in the formulation stage on the political side, when the elected officials are deciding how to formulate and craft those policies, who are they going to look for expertise? Members of the administrative, members of the agencies. So they're going to turn to these administrators, and administrators will advise elected officials on how to formulate those policies. We also know that the reverse can be true as well, in that we have politicians, we have elected officials who oftentimes get involved in the policy implementation phase. One of the primary jobs of any member of Congress is what's known as casework, where they go to the administration on behalf of one of their constituents to try and solve one of their constituents' problems. But whenever they do that, they are getting involved in the implementation of a policy. They are kind of bleeding over from the political world into the administrative world. So John Gauss in the 1930s recognized that this politics administration dichotomy is not really a clear dichotomy, and that we do have this bleed over between the world of politics and the world of administration. In the Wilson days, so after the writing of the Wilson article up to the 1930s, our approach to accountability was this approach known as the legal boundaries approach, that we had a political world, we had an administrative world. Administrators stay in the administrative world. If they venture into the political world and start, quote unquote, playing politics, then they are engaging in unethical activity. So it was argued that it was pretty clear to tell what was ethical, what was unethical. If you're just implementing the policy the way it's supposed to be implemented, that's ethical. If you're getting into policy formulation and getting in the political world and playing politics, that would be considered to be unethical. So it's a pretty clear division between what's considered ethical, what's considered unethical. When John Gauss came around with his writings in the 1930s, he told us that there are all these political challenges whereby the two worlds are overlapping with each other. So we can no longer just say if an administrator is engaging in politics, it's unethical, because a lot of the work of administrators is done on the policy formulation side. So it became much muddier and much more difficult for us to determine what was ethical and what was not ethical. Then along came the New Deal and FDR. As a response, we know, to the Great Depression and our discussion of federalism, we had the creation of all these different programs and all these alphabet agencies that were all created to try and pull state and local governments out of the depths of the Great Depression. But what it did is it had an exponential growth effect on the federal bureaucracy. So you had all these new agencies that were popping up as a result of the New Deal. All of these new agencies then started to develop their own cultures, their own set of norms and expectations for people within those agencies. So it made it very difficult for us to have one single set of ethical codes that we could apply across all the agencies throughout the federal government. There's no one single professional norm that will fit every single agency and every single organization's culture. So instead, in order to enhance adherence to ethics and accountability, we needed to take a much more contextual approach. and look at each individual organization, the culture that prevails within those organizations, and then tailor ethical adherence to those sets of norms and values and expectations that are sometimes unique to those agencies and organizations. So this is a long-winded way of saying that it's gone from a very clear way of defining ethical behavior in the legal boundaries approach to now modern public administration, it's much more difficult to do so. And it's not just as simple as having one central authority saying, here are the ethical principles, you adhere to all these different types of behaviors. Now we have to look at each individual organization and understand the differences and the nuances of each one of those organizations. That's why we have seen organizations develop their own codes of conduct. And a code of conduct of one organization may look different than the code of conduct of another organization. An example of this is whenever I do site visits for NASPA, our accrediting body. One of the things that we are going to look at is we're going to look at the values that underpin each one of these MPA programs. Every MPA program must put together its own public service values. And I'll tell you, there is a lot of variability in what those values look like across MPA programs. Our public sector values, I've shown you before for our program, will look a lot different than the ones for a program in another state. I won't name any specific programs I've been to, but they can look a lot different because we have to recognize that there are these different idiosyncratic approaches that are taken by these programs, are taken by these different agencies. So the moral of the story is it's become much more difficult for us to ensure accountability in the public sector. But what are we holding people accountable for? There are three basic elements of accountability, three different things we are holding people accountable for. The first one and the most common element of accountability is fiscal accountability. In fiscal accountability, we are primarily concerned with whether agency officials are spending money on the programs they are charged with managing and only on those programs. So are you only spending the money in the way in which that money has been appropriated? Most of you who work in public agencies, you have gone through auditing processes before. When I was on the school board, we had to have audits twice per year, not just general audits, but we also had to have audits of our proprietary funds. We had to have audits of our bond money. And so whenever we were spending that bond money for capital projects, we would have to have 2 audits per year looking at how that money was being spent. That's holding people accountable in a fiscal manner. And some of those audits can certainly be very lengthy. They can be very dense. Whenever you're reading through an audit, the one thing you're looking for is what's called an issue of materiality. An issue of materiality will then say there is a significant issue in terms of how this money was being spent. Either this money was being spent on the wrong thing that was not approved and was not authorized by law, or perhaps you have people in the organization who are spending the money that do not have the legal authority to be spending that money. Those would be issues of materiality. Those would be some major red flags in terms of fiscal accountability. So you hold people accountable for how they are spending the money. Is the money being spent in a legally appropriate manner? A second element of accountability is what we call process accountability. This is going to look at implementation. So we're concerned with how agencies are performing their tasks on a daily basis. We're holding them accountable for efficient and effective program or policy implementation. So, are they wasting money in how this program is being implemented? Are they not implementing the program efficiently enough so it's not reaching all the people it is supposed to reach? So you look at the implementation process, and that's process accountability. Then the third element of accountability is program accountability. Here we are looking at the outcomes, the consequences of implementing those programs. So program accountability is concerned with whether a public program has achieved its purpose as defined in law. So whenever we have a program that is created, that program will have stated goals and objectives. There will be a purpose that we're trying to achieve with that program. In program accountability, we are looking at whether or not we achieved that purpose. So in terms of this DLMPA program, When you talk about program accountability, you're going to talk primarily about that in your 696 research methods course. So in your 696 research methods course, the culminating activity in that course will be the creation of a program evaluation design, whereby you will put together a design that will allow you, you won't implement, but will allow you, if you're going to implement this design so that you could see how effective this program is in achieving its stated goals. That's program accountability. Fiscal accountability is something that you'll look more squarely at in your PPA 555 public budgeting and finance course. And so that's where you're going to get fiscal accountability. Process accountability you will get in PPA 660 organization theory. When we look at the interworkings of organizations, you'll also get it in PPA 670 policy issue analysis. And so this idea of accountability is something that you're not just dispensing with tonight. It is something that you will encounter again in all of your future core courses. And again, that's something we need to do for accreditation purposes, because we have chosen under NASPA guidelines to sprinkle accountability and ethics throughout all of our core courses, beginning here in 500 and then again in all the core courses you'll be taking in the program. So we oftentimes just use the term accountability as kind of this monolithic term, but there are really different elements of accountability, different things we can hold people accountable for. How they are spending money, if they're spending money in the right ways, in the legally appropriate ways, how they're spending in terms of the implementation of a program or a policy, and then how well are they achieving the results that are supposed to accrue as a result of this program or this policy. Assuring ethical adherence is something that has both got to come from the external as well as the internal. And the solution to holding people and agencies accountable for their actions really does hinge on this balance between external forces and internal forces. And by external forces, we are talking about those ethical regulations that are promulgated at the federal level, at the state level for federal and state agencies to follow. Those are your external forces. But if people are not well trained to adhere to those ethical standards, then they're not going to adhere to them. So in addition to having those external controls, we also have to have internal forces, such as hiring people with the character and the predisposition for public service, training administrators for how to do their jobs, not just efficiently and effectively, but in an ethical manner. So you both need the external as well as the internal. One of the most effective ways to identify ethical issues in an organization is by having members of that organization bring those issues to light. As we all know, those individuals are known as the whistleblowers. Now, when someone blows the whistle on an ethical violation in their organization, that means that person has two choices. Either that person, when they blow the whistle, can choose to stay within their organization and become what we call the voice of ethics within that organization, or that person can choose to exit the organization. Now, obviously, they're going to exit the organization if they feel reprisal and retribution from the blowing of the whistle. If they're protected from reprisal and retribution, there's a much better chance they will remain in the organization and continue to be the voice of ethics. That is what we want. So in order to keep people in these organizations, we have to protect them from reprisal, and we do that with these whistleblower protections. So I've linked on there. We won't go to these links here in class for the sake of time, but if you are interested, those should be working links here on the slides I have up on our Canvas site. The first one is a link to the Federal Whistleblower Protection Act and talks about some of the protections that whistleblowers have. And just, we'll talk more about this when we get to personnel and human resource management. But the primary protection that whistleblowers have is that if you are a whistleblower and you see something unethical going on within your organization, you can blow the whistle to what's called the Office of Special Counsel, otherwise known as the OSC. The OSC was created back in 1978 as part of the Civil Service Reform Act. It was originally created within this thing called the Merit Systems Protection Board. You could blow the whistle to the Office of Special Counsel. The Office of Special Counsel would then go out there and investigate your claim and would then render a decision about that claim, and then would provide you as the whistleblower with protections. So you could not be fired, you could not be demoted, you could not be denied promotions, you couldn't be denied training opportunities. Those things could not be done to you in terms of retribution because you blew the whistle on something going on within your organization. And that link will take you to some of the specific steps that whistleblowers can go through to blow the whistle on their agencies. If you're blowing the whistle more generally, and that you're seeing misspending of money, you're seeing that programs are not being implemented the way they're supposed to be implemented. That's a more general blowing of the whistle. That then goes to the Office of Special Counsel. If, however, you're blowing the whistle on a merit system violation that you personally are experiencing, so if you are told, do not report to work tomorrow because you belong to the wrong political party, that would be a violation of your merit principles. And you could then take your case to the Merit Systems Protection Board. Now, the problem was the original Office of Special Counsel was housed within the Merit System Protection Board when they were created in 1978. The problem was the Office of Special Counsel did not have its own staff. It did not have its own budget. It was completely reliant upon the Merit System Protection Board. Because it didn't have its own staff or its own budget, it ended up becoming overwhelmed with a backlog of cases. So in the Whistleblower Protection Act, in 1999, what we did is or the federal government did, is it pulled the Office of Special Counsel out of the Merit System Protection Board and made it its own independent organization with its own independent staffing and its own independent budget. Now, what will happen in the future to the Office of Special Counsel is a really good question because it's one of the agencies that's kind of on the hit list for the downsizing of the federal bureaucracy. So this may change a year from now, this discussion, but I don't know what the future holds for the Office of Special Counsel at this point in time. But that link will take you to the Federal Whistleblower Protection Act. And then the second link takes you to the Whistleblower Protection Act here in the state of California. So we have our own Whistleblower Protection Act here at the state level. And if you're interested in what that says, you can then follow that link and see all the particulars of the California Whistleblowers Protection Act. But it is imperative that we protect these whistleblowers so that they will remain in the organization and continue to be the voice of ethics. Again, who knows what best goes on with the organization than those individuals who are within that organization. And if you drive these whistleblowers out through retaliation and retribution, then you're not going to have that voice within the organization. Now, the common assumption is that the ethical standards in the public sector tend to be higher than ethical standards in private corporations. And again, that's a very blanket statement. And I'm sure there are certainly a lot of exceptions to that. But the idea here with having higher ethical standards in the public sector is that we are managing public taxpayer money. So this is not our money that we are managing as public administrators. This is not private money, this is public money. So therefore, we need to be held to those high ethical standards. A lot of the program benefits that we are delivering can be life and death benefits for these beneficiaries. So we need to be held to very high ethical standards. Some people, when they have gone from the private sector to the public sector, really do report this shock of ethical upgrade, and that there are a lot more procedures, there are a lot more processes they have to adhere to in the public sector than what they used to have to adhere to in the private sector. So these additional ethical procedures and processes is another good way that we can distinguish public service from private service. And this is something, a topic we'll get into a lot more next week, but those ethical differences is one of the primary ways we can differentiate between public service and private service. Since you have all these additional ethical standards and procedures in the public sector, that can sometimes make it difficult to attract people from the private sector to move into the public sector. So we have to strike a balance between hiring the most skilled administrators while still having the ethical standards to ensure that the public interest is being preserved. So it is very much this balance that we are striking in terms of public sector ethics. Because of all these ethical standards and all these processes that are inherent within the public service, it has sometimes been difficult for us to convince people to go and work for government. If you go and work in the private sector, there's a good chance that you'll get paid more money working in the private sector. And plus, you'll also end up having less things you'll have to do in terms of reporting requirements than what you'll have in the public sector. You might have a lot more flexibility to be innovative and creative in the private sector as compared to the public sector. So, the past several decades, we have worked very hard to try and make public service more appealing to the best and the brightest administrators. The quality of government really does depend on the quality of those who work in government and respect bureaucratic accountability and ethical behavior. Some previous presidents have worked very hard to make the public sector appealing. President George H.W. Bush was very well known for calling government service the highest and noblest calling of all. He was very much a proponent of the public sector and public service. He was a lifelong public servant. President Obama, in his 2008 campaign, said that one of his primary goals was to make government and public service cool again, to make it cool to work in the government in the public sector. The problem with those arguments is that for the most part, the bureaucracy in general is held in very low regard by the public. Whenever you say the word bureaucracy, you usually have all these negative attachments to it. So I say the word bureaucracy, people will probably think red tape, they'll think inefficiency, they'll think impersonal. Those are kind of the terms we associate with bureaucracy. We typically don't associate efficiency and effectiveness with bureaucracy. Charles Goodsell wrote a book back in 1970. I know it's a long time ago, but still is one of those classical readings in public administration. And his name is Charles Goodsell. And his book was called The Case for the Bureaucracy. And in it, he really does make this case for the bureaucracy. And he makes the argument that in order to make the public sector more appealing and to enhance the public opinion about public sector work, what we need to do is we need public administrators to be more proactive in their roles. We need public administrators to show the public how just about every single aspect of their daily lives will be touched by the government, will be touched by bureaucratic actions. So from the mattress you sleep on at night in terms of safety standards to the car you drive to work, that car being driven on publicly paid for and paved roads, the speed limit on that road, all the safety devices on that road, the traffic lights, all of that all goes back to the public sector. And sometimes members of the public don't really recognize just how influenced they are on a daily basis by the work of these government organizations. So Goodsell argued that it was important for public administrators to try and make that clear to members of the public. Public administration is complex. And when you read the Woodrow Wilson article, you'll see that even back in 1887, one of the arguments that Wilson made for creating this separate study of public administration is the complexity of government work, or what he called the quote unquote business of government. Well, if he thought that government work was complex in 1887, imagine what he would think about government work today. The public sector is very complicated. We're not just directly delivering services. We're engaged in indirect administration. We're engaged in governing networks where we are forming these networks with other public agencies. We are forming these networks with private sector organizations, with nonprofit and non-governmental organizations, sometimes international networks. So we've got a lot of complexity in the public sector. And people oftentimes, members of the public, treat bureaucracy as one monolithic type of entity. It's quote unquote government, or it's quote unquote, public organization. But we have different types of governments, we have different types of public organizations, and it's important for us to advocate for some of those differences so people better understand what the public sector is all about. Goodsell argued that one of the primary reasons why people have a negative view of the bureaucracy is because of their last interaction with a governmental organization. So they may have 9 great interactions, and that last 10th interaction was not a good interaction, and that then shapes their entire perception of government and bureaucracy. And so what we need to do is work proactively to try and make the public sector more appealing and show people just how important the public sector is to their daily lives. So as public administrators, it is true that in terms of ethical adherence, we have to keep in mind the contextual differences between government organizations. But we can still have some of these overarching principles that we all try and adhere to as public administrators. Now, since public administration is so complex, we as public administrators all share that same profession of public administration. However, some of us are engineers, some of us are budget analysts, some of us are HR managers. We come to this work in government from a variety of different academic and professional backgrounds. So we not only have a code of conduct from public administration, but we have to balance that code of conduct with the code of conduct being a professional engineer or being a professional financial manager. So we are really kind of juggling all these different ethical expectations. But the one that we all share as public administrators is the code of conduct from the American Society for Public Administration. This code of conduct consists of 8 different ethical principles. And let's go through those 8 different principles because this is information that will be very useful to you in doing your Canvas essay number 2. It'll also be very useful for you when you get to the midterm assessment, which has not been released yet, but I'll get that released by next Monday. And there'll be a question on there looking at the same issue of these 8 principles in the ASPA Code of Conduct. So these 8 different principles. Number 1 principle is public interest. To promote the interests of the public and to put service to the public above service to oneself. This is something that George Washington Plunkett and Tammany Hall did not do. So it's always the public interest being placed above your own private interest. Secondly, uphold the Constitution and the law. This is why we spent a lot of time last week going through the Constitution. Respect and support government constitutions and laws while seeking to improve laws and policies to promote the public good. So we need to respect and support government constitutions and laws. To respect and support those constitutions, we need to know what those constitutions, those laws actually say, which is why we covered it last week. Also, qualified good faith immunity, as we had mentioned in last week's class, means that we as public administrators must know the constitutional rights of people we interact with and then endeavor not to violate those constitutional rights. Number 3, to promote democratic participation. Inform the public and encourage active engagement in governance. Be open, transparent, and responsive, and respect and assist all persons in their dealings with public organizations. Now, this can sometimes be a double-edged sword, and there can again be kind of a disincentive for administrators to do this. The more you open up your decision-making process to the public, the more likely you are going to have the public contacting you and the public asking for things. And so you'll then have some direct lobbying, if you will, from the public onto administrators. So it really does kind of open those doors up. But it is important that we are open in how we make our decisions. On the next slide, we'll talk about the Brown Act and transparency laws here in California. But it's important that we are not only open to public inspection, but we also promote the participation of members of the public in democracy. Number 4, to strengthen social equity. Treat all persons with fairness, justice, and equality, and respect individual differences, rights, and freedoms. Promote affirmative action and other initiatives to reduce unfairness, injustice, and inequality in society. This idea of social equity is something that was really at the heart of the new public administration movement of people like H. George Frederickson and others. So in modern public administration, there's very much this emphasis placed upon social equity and social justice. I know a recent executive order rescinded an executive order on affirmative action. We have seen a lot of attempts currently to get the federal government to move away from DEI types of initiatives and to hold back funding for DEI types of initiatives. That's kind of what's going on in the political world. In the administrative world, this is still one of our elements of our code of conduct to try and strengthen social equity and social justice. Number five, to fully inform and advise. Provide accurate, honest, comprehensive, and timely information and advice to elected and appointed officials and governing board members and to staff members in your organization. This is the principal agent relationship. This is how we can overcome that moral hazard of not providing the information necessary to make oversight possible. You have to fully inform and advise elected and appointed officials and governing board members, even if it makes your life a little bit more difficult from an oversight perspective. Number six, to demonstrate personal integrity. This is why integrity is certainly one of our public sector values in our MPA program here. Adhere to the highest standards of conduct to inspire public confidence and trust in the public service. One of the articles that you read in the classics text was that one by Bennington and Moore looking at public value. In that article, Mark Moore makes the argument that public sector managers have an expository role. And by expository, we mean they have a role to role model, to kind of set a standard for others to follow. So if public managers can take that expository role in setting the standard in terms of demonstrating personal integrity, that will then instill faith and confidence in the public sector and hopefully undo some of this negative viewpoint that we talked about with the Good Cell book. Number seven, to promote ethical organization, to strive to attain the highest standards of ethics, stewardship, and public service in organizations that serve the public. We want our organizations to be ethical organizations. In your 660 organization theory course, we will talk about the idea of ethical organizations, and we'll talk about some of the ways in which leaders can embed ethical cultures into their organization, the primary and secondary embedding mechanisms they can use to try and help create this new culture of an ethical organization. And then number eight, to advance professional excellence, to strengthen personal capabilities to act competently and ethically and encourage the professional development of others. So not only to engage in our own professional development, but to encourage the professional development of others in the organization. One of the primary problems a lot of public organizations have is a lack of succession planning, where we've been waiting for years for this retirement tsunami to hit the public sector. We kind of saw a little bit of it in the post-COVID era, where now that a lot of public sector employees are being made to return to office. Some of them are just saying thanks, but no thanks, and they're going ahead and retiring, even if it's an early retirement. So we have seen the exodus to a limited degree of higher level administrators. Well, someone has to step up and fill those roles. And so it's going to be those younger employees, what Anthony Downs would call the climbers in the organization. So their professional development needs to be emphasized so that they will have the skills that they need in order to step into those higher level leadership and management positions. So those are the 8 principles that underlie the ASPA Code of Conduct. And then in Canvas essay number 2, you're going to be looking at these 8 and then selecting what you think the 3 most difficult or challenging ones would be, either to implement as an individual or to implement within your organization. But it's important because these are the 8 principles that we all share working in government organizations, irrespective of what our other profession is, whether engineers or they're HR managers. We all share these 8 principles in the ASPA Code of Conduct. One of those principles, as we saw, to go back here very quickly, is this idea of promoting democratic participation, informing the public and encouraging active engagement of governance, being open, transparent, and responsive. Here in the state of California, we have really placed a major emphasis on this idea of openness and transparency as ways to achieve ethical adherence. That if the public business is done in public, then the public will be able to watch how decisions are being made. They'll be able to watch how money is being spent, and they'll have the opportunity to comment on the decisions that are being made by these city councils or these boards of supervisor or these school district officials, governing board members. So you probably deal with some of these transparency and openness laws here in California if you work in the public sector. You probably know that the state of California has a lot more of these openness and transparency laws than a lot of other states around the country. This is really a major point of emphasis here in the state of California. One of the most famous transparency laws we have is the Brown Act. The Brown Act says a lot of things, but the primary thrust of the Brown Act is that public business must be conducted in public. So if you have a majority of the members of a city council, or the majority of the members of a school board who are meeting, that meeting is considered to be an open meeting. That meeting is governed by the Brown Act. So if you have 5 members of city council, 3 of those members are participating in decision making, that then needs to be an agendized open meeting done before the public. Now, if you only have 2 members who are having a conversation, that's exempted from the Brown Act. But once you have a majority, it then is covered by the Brown Act. You can't have a situation where you have 2 members of the school board who are discussing an issue, and then one of those members contacts another member, and then that member contacts another member, and then that member contacts another member. Even though you're only having 2 people at a time talking, that is still a violation of the Brown Act. That's what's known as a daisy chain violation, or what's called a serial meeting, and that would violate the Brown Act. So anytime you have a majority of your members, that is going to be agendized under the Brown Act. Agendas under the Brown Act for regular meetings need to be published 72 hours in advance under the Brown Act. Now, they have to be published 72 hours in advance because you want the public to know what is being discussed in these public meetings. So they have the opportunity to come to those meetings and to comment at those meetings. At those public meetings, you also have to have a public comment section of your meeting, time set aside for members of the public to get up and to address the board, address city council members on both agendized as well as non-agendized issues. You can't take any action on anything that is not agendized. So you can't just have one member during the meeting say, I was thinking about this issue. Let's come up with a policy on this issue. If that's not on the agenda, then you cannot make any decisions or have discussions on that issue. It must be something that's on the agenda so the public knows what is being decided upon. The Brown Act does allow for boards and for city councils to place reasonable limitations on the amount of time that is given for public comment. On my board, we had a 20-minute per topic limitation, a 3-minute per person limitation. That was not a hard limitation. That was just in our board policy. If for some reason we had a lot of people there who want to speak on a topic that would go longer than 20 minutes, I would just ask for unanimous consent from my other board members to extend the public comment time from 20 to 40 minutes, and it was never an issue. But you can have those reasonable limitations placed upon public comment. You can't comment on anything in public comment if you as a board member or a member of city council. You can't comment on anything that is non-agendized. And so sometimes members of the public will come and talk about something they're interested in that's not on the agenda. You cannot discuss that because it's not on the publicized agenda. That's for open session. You are allowed to have closed session where it's closed to the public. However, the issues that you can discuss in closed session under the Brown Act, that is a very limited number of issues. So things such as employee discipline and evaluation, because that's a personnel issue, that can be done in closed session. We had when I was on the board, unfortunately, there was a shooting. It wasn't our high school. We were an elementary district, but it was the high school that all my kids went to. There was a shooting in 2019. So we had a lot of discussions, actually before, but also after the shooting, about safety issues and how to harden school facilities at our 15 different schools. A lot of those discussions were allowed to be done in closed session because you don't want to talk about vulnerabilities, safety vulnerabilities in public session so that people know how to attack a school. So those things were allowed to be done in closed session. Discussions with your legal counsel can be done in closed session, but you have to have your legal counsel present. You can't just say, we're going to talk about this pending lawsuit as a board in closed session. That's a violation of the Brown Act. You have to have your legal counsel there and be talking directly to your legal counsel. So there are very limited things you can talk about in closed session. Members of the public also have the opportunity to comment on closed session issues as well. That's why you have to, if you're going into closed session or what some cities call executive session, you have to do that out of open session. So you must first start in open session, then you can recess into closed session and then come back into open session. But you always have to start in open session with the public. That's a requirement of the Brown Act. There's a lot more in the Brown Act too, but it just kind of shows you some of these transparency rules that we have here in the state of California. Some of you, in the course of your daily operations, you may deal with these things called public records requests. We have a California Public Records Act, and I have a link on there for that if you want to go and take a look at what that says. But under the California Public Records Act, any member of the public can put in a public records request. The public records request can be done with a simple email. And this is something some governments get confused about. They'll put together a form and say you have to fill out this form. That's not what the California Public Records Act says. It says that any member of the public, even through an email, can put in a public records request. So say, for instance, a member of the public thinks that there may have been some shenanigans in terms of a way in which a contract was issued. And so what they will do is they will ask for all of the information, all the correspondence on this contract that was granted. Then that government has 10 days to then respond to that public records request. Now, it doesn't mean they have 10 days to provide all the information that's being requested. Sometimes these requests will ask for information that goes back a decade. And it's going to take time to go and put all this information together and to go through all the correspondence and all the emails. And so you have 10 days to say, this is how long we think it will take us to put this information together. But you have to at least respond within those 10 days. This is a very costly thing for a lot of local governments. And we have seen an exponential increase in the number of public records requests at the local government level here in California, where you have some organizations that are having a dedicated individual that their only job is to work on these public records requests because they are so numerous and they are so time consuming. But it's important that people have this avenue to get access to this information. We also require that people in reportable positions fill out a Form 700, which is your conflict of interest form. That conflict of interest form has to be filled out every year. That conflict of interest form, you have to report any potential conflict of interest that you may have on business that is facing your city or your district. And so what you're able to do is if you own property in that jurisdiction and it's your primary residence, you're not renting it out, you're living there full time, that can be exempted from your conflict of interest form. But if you have any rental properties that generate income, you have to include those on your conflict of interest form. Income that you are earning from any sources located within your jurisdiction or doing business within your jurisdiction, that income must also be reported on your conflict of interest form. Investments need to be reported on the conflict of interest form, and at least signals the public that there may be a potential conflict of interest with this between this issue and this member of city council. So again, opens up members of city council, members of school boards, members of a board of supervisors to a lot of external scrutiny in terms of their finances, but it's important for ethical adherence. Now, to kind of wrap this up, I know we've been going on about this for a while, but to wrap it up, accountability in the public sector really does require the proper striking of a balance. We need to strike the balance between external controls and internal training of our administrators. We need to strike the balance between holding our administrators accountable for their actions, while at the same time not putting them in a box in terms of not giving them any latitude and flexibility to take risks and make good, innovative decisions. If people feel that they are going to get in trouble from a decision they're making, obviously they're not going to make that decision. So you have to balance ethical adherence with enough flexibility so people can make those good decisions in the best interest of the public. In other words, it's important that we balance ethical adherence with effectiveness, because balancing ethical adherence with effectiveness is critical to meeting the demands of our public. So it's not all one way or another. And there are different ways in which we can assure ethical adherence. You'll talk more about fiscal accountability when you get into public budgeting. You'll talk more about, process accountability and org theory and policy. You'll talk more about program accountability when you get into 696. So this is just kind of your really brief introduction to accountability and ethics in the public sector, just to give you that basic foundation. So as you move into your future core courses, you'll then talk about ethics within the parameters and within the scope of each one of those core courses in the future. So I promised you last week, I know I did a lot of talking last week. I promised you I wouldn't do as much talking in our future classes. And so I am going to be good for that promise. And so that's what I have to say about accountability and ethics. And now what we would like to do is see what you have to say about accountability and ethics. And so what I thought we would do is a breakout group exercise where I will create some breakout rooms. And then in each one of those rooms, each group will do the following. Each breakout room will consider a recent example of an ethical violation in the public or the nonprofit sector. So ethical violation that you have seen. It doesn't have to be something in your organization. It can be something that you have seen on the news. It could be something at the national level or the state level or the local level. But a recent example of an ethical violation that you are somewhat familiar with. And unfortunately, there is no lack of these ethical violations that you can choose from. And we just recently saw, Senator Menendez, who was just sentenced to, I think, 11 years in prison for some of his ethical violations. The city of Bell had the very famous ethical violations from a few years ago. So each group should pick one example of ethical violation, briefly describe what happened in that situation, then which of the ASPA principles were violated, which of those 8 ASPA principles were violated, how should the problem have been addressed, and so answer those 3 things. What happened in the situation? Which of the ASPA principles you feel were violated? And then how the problem should have been addressed at the time. And each group should pick one spokesperson, because what we will do is we'll spend about half an hour, 45 minutes on this exercise. Then we will reconvene as a class. And we reconvene as a class. The spokesperson for each group will then share out what the group came up with, and then we'll see what types of similarities and differences we see from each of the groups. So that's going to be our breakout group exercise. Are there any questions on what we're doing with this exercise? Okay. Then the next thing is up to me to go ahead and create our breakout rooms. I know we are a pretty large cohort, which is a good thing. But we will do, I think 4 breakout rooms usually work pretty well. So I'll create 4 breakout rooms, just assign people randomly. So it means we'll have 6 to 7 people in each room. Okay, I have now created the breakout rooms and assigned everybody to a breakout room. So I will open up the rooms, and then you can go to your assigned breakout room, work on this exercise. Like I said, we'll spend about half an hour, 45 minutes on it. I'll give you a 10-minute warning. I'll give you a 5-minute warning. And I'll give you a 2-minute warning when we're ready to reconvene. Then I'll close the rooms, we'll reconvene, and the spokesperson from each group can share what you came up with. So let me go ahead and open the rooms, and then you can go about your business. All right, the rooms are open, so feel free to go to your room and start working on the exercise.